Well, thank you, Jessica, for that very kind introduction. I'm figuring out how to work this. I'm so delighted to be here. As I told Jessica and everybody else who would listen, I have an old family connection to this area, even though I don't know the area very well, but my dad's family is from Deal Island in the middle of the Chesapeake, where I've never been, but I feel like I'm closer to it here now, so I'm happy to be able to share this with you. As Jessica said, I'm gonna talk from something that might turn out to be a part of this book. The book has been developing, gestating, I think, for a very long time, and hopefully it will come to fruition at some point. But it is about this question: what's the proper dignity of human being? And really, when I say that sounds like a fancy way of thinking. That sounds like a fancy question. But really, it's the question, something like, what is it to be human? And I feel like that's a question that we've all got a stake in, and a question that we all have maybe some intuitions about. And I think it's both a necessary question and an incredibly complicated one. It turns out there's a philosophical tradition devoted to thinking about this question, and so I want to push on it a little bit. It begins with a story about an event that took place in the middle of the 20th century. So one of the most famous philosophical debates of the 20th century took place just after the end of the Second World War. It featured the two great titans of mid-20th century European philosophy, Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre. And the debate was wide-ranging, but at its center was a fundamental question, and that's the question, what is it to be human? Sartre proposed for his brand of existential philosophy, Sartre was known as an existentialism, what he called a kind of humanism that elevated our kind of being to a radical new place. Like God in the medieval Christian view, according to Sartre, we are the kinds of beings who bring about ourselves. God, in this medieval version of the story, sort of exists because he wills himself to exist. And everything in the universe on that medieval version of the story exists because God wills it to exist. By willing it, things come into being. And Sartre didn't believe in God, but he thought, well, we're kind of like that, only in a limited way, with respect to ourselves. We come to be who we are by willing certain things about ourselves. Heidegger wasn't impressed by this Sartrean view. Humanism has a long history, he claimed, going back at least to the Greeks and the Romans, and it took on many forms. Sartre's way of celebrating the greatness of humanity was new, according to Heidegger, but it was not essentially different from this whole history that Heidegger was critical of. Moreover, he argued, the entire humanistic tradition is fundamentally bereft. No form of humanism can realize what Heidegger called the proper dignity of human beings. So on this view, which I want to push on a little slice of it today, no story about what it is to be human from the ancient Greeks forward in the philosophical tradition has ever really gotten at what it is to be us. Heidegger's position turned out to be much more original and much more interesting than Sartre's, I think, and it came to be much more influential. Indeed, it's no exaggeration to say that Heidegger was, I think this is true, the most influential European philosopher of the 20th century. But if Heidegger's work is essential, it's also famously obscure, not to mention marred by his awful political commitments. This talk, and the book manuscript from which it's drawn, is an attempt to understand one of the central threads of that position. The question that I want to address is, what is the proper dignity of human being, and how does it demand that we live our lives? Now, alas, I'm not going to be able to answer these questions in any satisfying kind of detail here. Indeed, I'll mainly try to introduce the questions and say something about one of their most important historical moments during the high point of the Enlightenment, but I hope that'll begin a discussion, and I will gesture at what I think is something like a proper answer to the question at the very end. So I'll start with a little section that I call the background to the letter, and it's organized around the question, what is humanism? On November 10th, 1946, a French philosopher named Jean Beaufret wrote a letter to Martin Heidegger. Beaufret asked a number of questions in the letter, some of them provoked by Jean-Paul Sartre's already famous lecture from the year before, Existentialism is a Humanism. But Heidegger took one of these questions to be of central importance. I noticed I have a handout. Oh, that's nice. Okay. You have a handout too. The handout has a lot of quotations, some of which I'll read. You can doodle on the rest of them. So the question that Heidegger thought was centrally important was this question that Beaufret asked him, how can we restore meaning to the word humanism? In December of the same year, Heidegger wrote back to Beaufret, organizing his response around that question. Heidegger reworked, expanded, and published the letter several months later in 1947, and the apparently long and rambling piece that resulted from this exchange is in fact deeply rich and provocative. It's come to be known as Heidegger's Letter on Humanism. And every other year I teach this letter, and I spend, I think, probably 4 weeks on it in a course on later Heidegger. It's long and it's hard to understand what its organizational structure is, and it's using all sorts of new terminology, and it takes a long time to get used to it. But when you do, I think there's something interesting in it. One of the interesting things is that a lot of the phrases that are famously associated with Heidegger's later work really find their focus in that letter. So if you've never heard of these phrases, I'll just list some of them. Don't worry about it. If you have heard of them, you're probably thinking, I've heard that. I have no idea what it means. I feel that way a lot of the time too. But I'll just list them. This is the sort of center of his work. So in that letter, he says that language is the house of being, a famous phrase. He says that human beings are the shepherd of being. He says that thinking came to an end with philosophy. What a weird thing to say. Thinking came to an end. Once philosophy started, thinking stopped. And we need to rediscover how to think. He said that metaphysics, which is another name that he has for philosophy from Plato to Sartre, fails to ask about the truth of being. And the last one is so obscure I won't even read it. So he says all of these things. They have something to do with what he thinks is a sort of deeply new, original way of thinking about what it is to be us and what it is to be anything that is. Now, I think in the center of this letter, on my way of reading it, really is this question, what is it to be us? What is the proper dignity of human beings? So that's the question that I want to focus on here. The dignity of something, this is maybe a little old-fashioned, the dignity of something is whatever it is that makes it into the kind of thing that it is. So the dignity of human being is whatever it is about us that makes us special as the kinds of beings that we are. And if you were living in the medieval Christian world, for instance, you'd have thought that the dignity of human being is that we're created in the image and likeness of God. That's what they believed. Or if you lived in Aristotle's world, you'd have thought the dignity of human being is that we're he says it in Greek, the zoon, logon, echan. That's the animal that has logos, that has something like rationality or thinking. So the question is, what is it that's our proper dignity that characterizes us as the being that we are? So Heidegger talks about this in the letter, and I'll just quote some of the things he actually goes through in pretty quick, in just a few pages, sort of quick synopsis of different views that people have taken on this question. So he says, for instance, this is number 1 in your handout. He's talking here, I think, about Cicero, the Roman philosopher from the 1st century BCE. He says, for Cicero and for people living in the Roman Republic, to be human, humanitas, humanity, explicitly so called, was first considered and striven for in the age of the Roman Republic, 1st century BC, before there were emperors. Homo humanus, the human being, was opposed to Homo barbarus, the barbaric being. And the Greeks and the Romans both used the word barbarian this way to talk about people who weren't properly human. For the Greeks, that meant people who didn't speak Greek. Literally, it sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar whenever they spoke. And so that's where the Greek word barbaros comes from. But they contrasted proper human beings who express the dignity proper to the kind of being that we are, with barbarians, the people who don't express that kind of characteristic. And they thought it had something to do with the way you speak. Even medieval scholastic Christianity was humanism on Heidegger's view. If you know anything about normal ways of talking about the history of humanism, this might sound a little bit surprising, but Heidegger thinks that medieval scholastic Christianity is humanistic too, whereas the classical pagans, like Cicero, distinguished genuine human beings from barbarians. The medieval Christian tradition distinguished even the best human beings from God. So you ask what it is to be us by trying to figure out what it is to be not us. And for the Greeks and Romans, the not us were the barbarians. And for the medieval Christians, the not us was God. So it's an interesting contrast between the two cases. Heidegger says, I think this is 2 on your handout, the Christian sees the humanity of man, the humanitas of homo, in contradistinction to deitas, in contradistinction to the deity or to God. The emphasis in medieval Christianity is on the idea that human beings depend upon God's eternal love and grace to be at their best. So the medieval human being, according to Heidegger, is the person of the history of redemption. This is the rest, I think, of your number 2, who, as a child of God, hears and accepts the call of the Father in Christ. Man is not of this world, since the world, thought in terms of Platonic theory, is only a temporary passage to the beyond. So this is a story about what it is to be us, that places us in dependence upon God and highlights the fact that our salvation will happen when we enter eternity, when we enter the paradisiacal world of God's heaven. So that's the medieval Christian view, also a kind of humanism in Heidegger's way of using the term. Now, when Sartre says that existentialism is a humanism in 1945, he develops his view against the background of his assumption of atheism. Sartre was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. So the idea that the Sartrean existentialist form of humanism belongs under the same heading as the medieval Christian form of humanism gives you a sense for how broad the category of humanism is in Heidegger's reading of it. And I'll say something about what I think the term means for Heidegger in just a moment. Well, right now, in fact, the next sentence. In both cases, human beings are identified by a set of substantive, general, essential, and unchangeable properties. To be human is to have these properties, to be created in the image and likeness of God for the medievals, something else that we'll talk about in a moment for Sartre. But the properties are different in the case of the medieval Christians and in the case of Sartre. Indeed, in Sartre's case, some of the central properties that in the medieval view identified God, the opposite of us for the medievals, are the very ones that now identify us for Sartre. So we get this sort of wild picture of changes in the understanding of what it is to be human, but they all have to do with the idea that there's some set of properties that characterizes us properly. Now, a central feature of Sartre's position involves what you could call the apotheosis of human beings. We rise up to the place of God, in his view. As a committed atheist, God's non-existence for Sartre leaves open the need for some being in the universe who can, like God used to be able to do in the scholastic tradition, bring it about that he is or she is, or that they are in a certain way, through the very subjective act of making a choice. And this is number 3 on your handout. This is from Sartre now. Sartre says, if God does not exist, there's at least one being in whom existence precedes essence. That's Sartre's way of thinking about what the medieval Christians thought God was. God doesn't have an essence that determines what it is for him to exist. He comes to have his essence by being who he is and by making choices. And this being is man, or as Heidegger says, Dasein. So Sartre's view intends to put us in the place of God. Sartre starts off by saying there is no God, and then he says, but still there must be some being who brings it about that the world is and the people in it are in a certain way, and that being is us. It's, as I say, an extreme aggrandization of human being, greater than any conceived of in the history of the West. On Sartre's view, we are the beings who bring it about that we are essentially what we are by virtue of making the very choices that we do. I bring it about that I'm a coward, for instance, by choosing to perform cowardly acts. And on Sartre's view, everything I do is a result of a choice that I've made. So if I act in a cowardly way, Sartre says, well, I chose to do that. You might think it was external circumstance or something. Sartre says, no, this is a hard view. This is a view that gives you responsibility for everything. And if you're a coward, it's because you've chosen to perform the cowardly acts that make up your life to this point. Or I could bring it about that I'm a great lover, Sartre's example, by choosing to engage in great loves. And furthermore, absent these choices, I'm nothing with respect to those essential properties. Sartre says, it doesn't even make sense to say, well, I'm a great writer, I just haven't written anything great yet. You're not a great writer if you haven't written anything great yet. It's a very harsh, really stark view. Everything you do, you're responsible for, and when you do it, it brings it about that you are the kind of person who does that thing. But as great as Sartre's account makes us, it still does not recognize our proper dignity, the dignity appropriate to us as the kinds of beings that we are, according to Heidegger. And that's what I want to focus on today. So section 2 is called What is Our Proper Dignity? Or on your handout, Kant on Dignity and Heidegger's Early Alternative. In fact, I think I'm only going to get through the end of section 2 in the talk today. But buckle up, because we're going to start talking about Kant. So it's going to get exciting. I can't wait. Okay, so to see what Heidegger thinks is wrong with even Sartrean humanism, we have to understand why humanism as a whole fails to recognize our proper dignity. The proper dignity of human beings, I've said already, is something like whatever it is about us that gives us the status we have in the realm of what is. That's our proper dignity. And somehow humanism mischaracterizes that. Now, and I've said humanism is whatever it is that identifies us by saying that some essential range of properties determine us as the being that we are. Now, it's probably not an accident that Heidegger uses the precise word dignity here. It's, as I said, a kind of old-fashioned use of the word. You might have thought he'd just ask, what is it to be human? And he asks it that way in other contexts. But what is the proper dignity of human being means that, but it has other resonances as well. I think it's not an accident that he chose that word. That's because it's a famous word in the history of philosophy. And in referring to our proper dignity, Heidegger is simultaneously invoking and retrieving, and I think overturning that history and appropriating it for his own use. So let's begin by seeing how. So my notes say, start here for a more technical version of the talk. So here we go. Okay. So probably the most famous philosopher to talk of human dignity, and certainly the most influential one, is Kant. Immanuel Kant, 18th century German philosopher. He claims that human beings have a dignity rather than a price. There may be, by the way, some overlap between this and an essay of mine that I published recently that I think some of you have read, maybe yesterday or the day before or something. Let's see. You tell me how much overlap there is. I didn't compare them. As Kant writes in The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, and this is number 4 on your handout, That which is related to general human inclinations and needs has a market price, a price in a market, what you pay for it when you buy it. That which, without presupposing any need, accords with a certain taste. These are like aesthetic objects with pleasure in the purposeless play of our faculties. That's a Kantian way of thinking about the beautiful. So aesthetic objects have a fancy price, never mind those. But that which constitutes the condition under which alone something can be an end in itself does not have mere relative worth or price, but an intrinsic worth, a dignity. And when he says that which alone something, that which can be an end in itself, he's thinking about us. In other parts of Kant's work, he says human beings are the beings that can only properly be treated as an end in themselves and never as a mere means. So to be human is to be the kind of being, according to Kant, who, about whom it's always inappropriate for someone else to use you as an instrument towards some end of their own. Human beings are only ever properly used as an end in themselves, or only ever properly an end in themselves. According to this passage, the distinguishing feature of human beings is that their value or worth is intrinsic to them. Human beings have no price because the price of something is a measure of its worth or value that's determined by what other things one could exchange it for. It's a relative rather than an intrinsic measure of worth, price is. Because human beings have an intrinsic worth, their value can't be measured in terms of price. There's no amount of money, says Kant, that you could properly pay for a human being. What this definition doesn't say, however, is what it is in virtue of which our kind of being has the intrinsic worth that it does. So we can agree that human beings are such that it's never appropriate to pay a certain amount for one of them. But that somehow doesn't tell us enough. We want to know more. It doesn't say what it is in virtue of which our kind of being has the intrinsic worth that it does. Why is it that we have this kind of dignity rather than a price? Instead, the definition is merely negative. It says that we are whatever kind of being it is that cannot be valued in the market economy. Yes, Kant says elsewhere, we're the beings that are ends in themselves, but this is just the same negative definition. It says that we have no instrumental value. We can't properly be used for some other end. We're not good because we're good for this or that purpose. We're good without any other end than ourselves. And that's really just another way of saying that we have dignity but no exchange value. So although Kant, it seems to me, is right to say that human beings are not the kind of being that have a price, that doesn't tell us enough about what it is that's special about us. Moreover, I think by saying that's what we're not, he's implicated in the kind of move that we saw the Greeks and the Romans were implicated in, and that the medieval Christians were implicated in, the move that defines us by saying what our opposite is. To define, and I think that what our opposite is something that has a price, which puts us in the economic realm as a kind of definition, even if we're what's not properly defined by it. So it's a kind of negative definition, but to define something negatively is to take what it's not to be more basic or fundamental than what it is. You see this in the medieval Christian view. If human beings are what God are not what God is, then in some sense God is more fundamental. But if I say, for instance, that the Australian Shepherd is a dog that has no tail. Does anyone know Australian Shepherds? We used to have one. They're fun, energetic dogs, but they don't have a tail. And so if you say that the Australian Shepherd is a dog that has no tail, then you define it, at least implicitly, as a deviation from the more basic or the more normal case of a dog, the one that does have a tail. This general fact suggests that, in some sense or another, the basic kind of thing for Kant, the thing with respect to which human beings with their intrinsic dignity are a deviation, is the one that has a market value, a price. If the human being is the being that has no price, then it's a deviation from the norm of those things that do have a price. So in some sense, I think although Kant's right to say that human beings are not the kind of being that have a price, by defining us that way, he sort of says, well, the norm is things that do have a price. And all of a sudden we institute a regime where this kind of economic analysis of everything seems the appropriate way to approach stuff. So this orientation, I believe, is characteristic of the Enlightenment. We could call it the market economical analysis of the human self. It first reaches a place of prominence in history, probably, with Locke's emphasis on the value of and the moral justification of private property. Locke's discussion of property, you might recall, starts from the idea that our own persons and bodies are owned by us in a special private way. Locke develops his views about private property most famously in chapter 5 of the second treatise on government. I think this is number 5 on your handout. There in 527, for instance, he writes, though men as a whole, human beings as a whole, he means, own the earth and all inferior creatures, already a striking claim. Though human beings as a whole own the earth and all inferior creatures, every individual person has a property in his own self. That's to say, every individual person owns him or herself. This is something that nobody else has any right to. The labor of your body and the work of your hands, we may say, are strictly yours. Again, the foundation of a kind of liberal view of the world and of human being and human dignity and human freedom. You have a special relationship to yourself. There's some sense in which that's got to be right. But there's also some sense in which I think it gets us into a bunch of problems. The Lockean account of the self, in other words, assumes that persons are a kind of property over which we have special ownership rights. The idea that the most important relationship that we could have to ourselves is the same as the relationship you have to the toaster that you bought at Walmart last week. Seems to me like that's a bit of a caricature of the position, but that's the kind of thing that I'm worried about. The residue of this kind of economic analysis of the self is found in Kant's negative account of human dignity, I want to claim. But Kant says something more about our dignity as well. He gives a positive account of it, or what looks like a positive account of it. So what's that account? Well, I come from a department that's famous with my colleague Chris Korsgaard for giving Kantian interpretations of morality. And so I know how voluminous the literature on Kant's practical philosophy is, and I definitely don't want to wade much into it. But I'll just say this. Human dignity for Kant is positively associated with the fact that human beings are properly measured by standards of morality that presuppose a certain kind of freedom to choose. So this is Kant's view. Somehow the standard of morality that applies to us invokes this freedom to choose that's characteristic of us. In Kant's case in particular, our dignity seems to arise from our freedom to use now a bunch of Kantian words. You can just ignore them if they don't make sense to you. Pure practical reason autonomously to give ourselves and hold ourselves to the moral law. So somehow we have the freedom to choose to act in a moral way, to hold ourselves to a law that we can rationally discern that characterizes what it's right to do. We are, in other words, according to this formulation, universal law givers. We freely choose the law in accordance with which we act, and we give that law to ourselves as a universal constraint on all rational action. Okay, that's a lot of Kant stuff, but the core of it has to do with the idea that the positive account of our dignity involves our autonomy, our freedom to choose how to act and whether to act in a moral way. Leaving aside the particular details of Kant's account, which are many and complex, I'd like to focus here solely on its background presupposition that human dignity depends on a certain kind of freedom to make choices. You can see the connection with Sartre, who we started with here. I think Sartre and Kant are on a trajectory from one to the other. This is a distinctive presupposition that human beings have a kind of freedom to make choices. It's not found in this particular way, as far as I can tell, before the early modern period. That's really a kind of view about the human self or human beings that starts around 1600 and comes to fruition with Kant. Furthermore, its distinctiveness is related to the distinctiveness of the market economical account of the self. That's because to think of the self as a bit of property over which one has special ownership rights is to encourage an account of the self's activity, what you do when you make choices or will things or believe things, in terms of this kind of property ownership as well. On such a model, our freedom to choose is naturally interpreted as the absence of factors that might constrain our ability fully to bring about or generate or be the source or ground of the choices that we make. Things go wrong with respect to the kind of being that we ought to aim to be when something gets in the way of our ability autonomously to make choices. That's pushing in the direction of a kind of traditional modern liberal view of the self. On such a, if the normative aim of the self is the ownership of its activity in this way, where to own an activity is to be its sole generative ground. I've autonomously come to make a choice if I wasn't forced by someone else to do it, but if the choice came out of me, I was the generative ground of the choice. I owned the choice in that sense. If you have that view, then we're naturally pushed towards a model of the self as a bounded, internal subject whose activity must aim to shield itself from external influence. By focusing so much on the importance of autonomy, you invoke an idea of the self that makes the thing that's dangerous for us, anything that gets in the way of our ability all on our own to stand there and make a choice. We can only own our choice-making activity authentically on a view like Kant's if we generate it absent any influences from without. Now, the general form of this model of the human self is what Charles Taylor has called the buffered self. Charles Taylor's a very famous Canadian philosopher who's still alive, 92, I think, years old, and still about to publish a huge 2-volume book. I admire him so much. He calls this the buffered self, a modern understanding that's predicated on the assumption of a firm boundary between the self and what the self is not. So there's somehow we are, like Descartes thought, characterized by this relation that we have to ourselves independent of anything outside of us. This boundary, according to Taylor, allows the buffered self to, quote, see itself as invulnerable, as master of the meanings of things for it. That's a quote, but it's not on your handout. We can hear Sartre's extreme version of this model in Taylor's description of the generic type. For Sartre, I'm not just any kind of master of the meanings of things. I'm master in the extreme sense that I'm radically free to choose the essence of who I am. Whatever form the buffered self takes, however, its general aim is of a piece with, or maybe motivated by, the market economic analysis of the self that begins not least with Locke. It's by thinking of the self as a kind of property over which one has special ownership rights that the buffering of the self begins. The Enlightenment account of our dignity in this way depends upon the background assumption that to be human is to be characterized by that freedom of choice that's characteristic of the buffered self. To be human in this Enlightenment understanding, in other words, is to aim constitutively at owning one's choice-making activity by keeping it free from external influence. Okay, that's the high point of the Enlightenment view that really comes to fruition with Kant and then develops sort of to its logical conclusion with Sartre. And I think it's a form of humanism, and I want to make sense of Heidegger's claim, which he doesn't really spell out, that somehow this mischaracterizes the proper dignity of human being. And I want to try to spell it out, at least briefly, by saying something about the kind of thing that I find in Heidegger's writings that's an alternative to this. By contrast with this, when Heidegger uses the word dignity and when he suggests that we've failed still to grasp the proper dignity of human being, he means something different from what Kant means, from what Sartre means. Admittedly, Heidegger's use of the term does in some ways build upon Kant's use of it, but it aims to overturn Kant's view as well. Perhaps Kant and his Enlightenment allies have revealed something significant, Heidegger seems to think, when they locate our dignity in our freedom to choose. Perhaps we can accept, therefore, that they've uncovered an aspect of human being that's appropriate and relevant for our point in history, an aspect, moreover, that's covered up by the understanding of previous epochs, the Greek and Roman epoch, the medieval epoch. Still, the market economical analysis of the self forces a narrow interpretation of the essence of both freedom and choice. So you can say, fine, we're the being that's free to choose, but what you thought freedom meant and what you thought choice meant is sort of all off base. Our proper dignity is more fundamental, more capacious, and more ennobling, I want to say, than the economic analysis of the self allows. It's indeed a kind of dignity. It involves a notion of freedom and even a certain kind of choice. But the Enlightenment hasn't pushed hard enough on these phenomena to understand them and the dignity they associate with us in the proper or authentic way. So let me say something about the alternative. Now, the word that Heidegger uses when he talks about our proper dignity, which it could be translated also our authentic dignity, is eigentliche. That's the German word. And that's the root of the German word Eigentlichkeit, which is usually translated authenticity in translations of Heidegger's Being and Time. Since at least the period of Being and Time, which was published in 1927, authenticity, Eigentlichkeit, is the term that Heidegger used to pick out that mode of existence that brings us out best as the being that we are. So authenticity is somehow associated with dignity. So something about the traditional notion of dignity and the freedom to choose that the Enlightenment associates with it amounts to a misappropriation of the authentic form of that phenomenon, the phenomenon of human being. Our freedom is not to be understood primarily as freedom from constraint, from external constraint, which is what Kant thinks. Our ability to choose is not to be understood principally as the ability spontaneously to bring it about that we are essentially a certain way, as it is for Sartre. More fundamentally, if the human self owns itself, and if it expresses this norm of self-ownership by manifesting a certain kind of freedom to choose, then these phenomena are grounded in an account of the self that arises from principles of authenticity rather than principles of market economy. So that's the contrast I want to draw here. Those are the names for the positions, the market economical analysis of the self and the analysis of the self according to which there's a kind of authenticity appropriate to it. I'll later say a third thing that has to do with dignity proper. I won't get to it here, but I'll gesture at it. To ask for our proper or our authentic dignity, therefore, is not only to ask for the account that's most appropriate to us. You hear the word proper in the word appropriate. It's to suggest further that such an account must be grounded in, and this is the thing that the authenticity view adds, our capacity to be appropriate to who and what we are. That's such a weird sentence. So I just want to read it out loud again. To ask for our proper dignity or our authentic dignity is not only to ask for the account that's most appropriate to us, the account of human being that gets us as the being that we are. It's also to suggest further that such an account must be grounded in our capacity to be appropriate to who and what we are. We're the beings who can act in such a way that in acting that way, we sort of come to measure ourselves with respect to a standard of what's appropriate to us. The account of our dignity is authentic, in other words, when it's based on the recognition that to be human is to be capable of authenticity. So the importance of this kind of authenticity is clear already in Heidegger's early work. It suggests a notion of self-ownership that's distinct from Locke's version based on property rights. In Being and Time, I think this is so weird and funny, but interesting, Heidegger agrees that in some sense we own ourselves. I have the word own in sort of scare quotes there. Locke thought we own ourselves the way we own the toaster. Heidegger thinks we own ourselves, but he means something different. After all, Dasein, he says, this is a famous line from the beginning of Being and Time, Dasein is in each case mine. So to be mine means I own myself in some way. Dasein is his name for us. We're the kinds of beings that are in each case, I'm the kind of being that is in each case mine. But this notion of self-ownership doesn't proceed for Heidegger, as it does for Locke, from the claim that the self is a kind of property. Rather, for early Heidegger, Dasein, us, we, are our possibilities, not our properties. And our possibilities are not to be understood as any kind of property we own. And now I think number 7, I did number 6 on your handout. Number 7, Heidegger writes, in each case, Dasein, again, Dasein is Heidegger's funny German name for human beings. Dasein is its possibility, and it has, in scare quotes, this possibility, but not just as a property, as something present at hand would. So we have our possibilities, but not the way we have our toaster. That's the claim that he's making there. So he's introducing some distinction. Heidegger's account of our authentic form of self-ownership builds upon this insight. To be authentic, on Heidegger's view, is to be the same as, or at one with, who one is. This German word Eigentlichkeit has the root word eigen in it, which just means one or same or self or something. To be authentic, to be Eigentlichkeit, is to be who or what one is. To own oneself, therefore, is to be of one's own somehow. As Heidegger says, this is his phrase, Dasein is essentially something which can be authentic, that is, something of its own. That's number 8 on your handout. So this passage allows us to put the difference between Heidegger and the Enlightenment in a pithy form. For both, to be human is to be involved in some form of self-ownership. But they understand this self-ownership in dramatically different ways, one in terms of authenticity, the other in terms of property rights. In short, to be of its own is importantly different than to be what one owns. Heidegger's for the former, human beings are the beings that are of their own, and Locke and Kant are for the latter. Human beings are the beings who own themselves. They are what they own. This distinction seems to be one promising way into an analysis of the central contrast between Heidegger and the Enlightenment. To summarize, the market economical analysis, which is characteristic of Enlightenment figures like Locke and Kant, understands the self as a kind of property over which one has special ownership rights. By contrast, Heidegger follows what I'd like to call a counter-Enlightenment thread, in this case owing a big debt to figures like Paul, Augustine, Luther, Kierkegaard, that understands the self in terms of its ability to be true to the kind of being it already is. So far, this is just a pithy and maybe a provocative characterization of the distinction. I hope it'll become fuller over the course of the chapter. We won't get to much of that. But for the time being, we can just try to remember that when later Heidegger asks about our proper dignity or our authentic dignity, he has in mind the idea that our dignity consists in our being capable of owning ourselves and our activity by expressing in it authentically what kind of being we are. Whatever the full account of that is, whatever Heidegger's account of human being, it's only crudely approximated by, and in some important ways even covered up by, the market economical analysis of the self. Now, I've drawn the distinction so far as if it pits Heidegger against Enlightenment views of the self, and it does, but Heidegger's criticism is meant to apply to humanism quite generally. That's philosophy from Plato to Sartre, on Heidegger's view. Although it's not until the Enlightenment that we get the claim that human beings are characterized by the dignity appropriate to a being who's free to choose, nevertheless, all the previous accounts of human being make a presupposition of one sort or another that also mischaracterizes our kind of being on Heidegger's account. To see why humanism as a whole fails to realize our authentic dignity, therefore, we have to pursue the issue further. We have to ask in particular what Heidegger thinks the tradition of humanism presupposes about us that's guaranteed to lead it astray. The short answer to that question is that humanism in general thinks that to be human is to have a certain range of properties. Either we're the being that has logos, or we're the being that's made in the image and likeness of God, or we're the being that has to be treated as an end in itself. Whereas Heidegger thinks the real characterization of us is that we're the being who doesn't have some static, unchangeable, essential set of properties, but who acts in a certain way, acts in a way that's accessible with respect to what it takes to be us authentically. But I won't spell it out more here, but I'm going to give you a kind of analogy. Alas, there's not enough time to answer that question here, but what I've said might be enough to point in the direction of an answer. It has to do with the idea that to identify human beings by means of any set of substantive, general, essential, and unchangeable properties is to misunderstand some crucial aspect of the dignity proper to us as the human beings we are. In particular, it's to misunderstand that to be human, and this is a very pithy version of the positive view, to be human is always and inevitably to be involved in taking a stand in everything you do on the very question what it is to be human. That's a weird kind of self-referential thing. I'll give you an analogy. To understand this better, I think, we'd have to think about the connection between philosophy and being human. In a longer version of this talk, how could there be a longer version of this talk? In a longer version of the talk that starts later, I go into this, but I'll give you a short version of this. In my view, the connection between philosophy properly understood, not philosophy as Heidegger thought it was done between Plato and Sartre, but philosophy as it was originally intended, it has a deep connection to being human. Suppose we think of philosophy, and I'm tempted to think this is the right way to think of philosophy, as the set of all those questions that are so hard and so significant and so essentially question-worthy. Somehow they strike you as questions that need to be asked. It's the set of all those questions that have all those properties that to ask them in a way that does justice to the kinds of questions they are, we also, and at the same time, have to ask what method is appropriate for asking them well. I'll say it again. Philosophy is the set of all those questions that are so deep and significant, feel like they have to be asked by human beings. What is it to be human? What is justice? What is freedom? What is piety in one of Plato's examples? What is the good? What is the beautiful? These questions seem so significant for us, so fundamental to our task of being human well. But it's also true that they're significant in such a way that it doesn't seem obvious that there's a pre-existing method for answering questions like that. What would that method be? I mean, if you're interested in asking questions like the questions that physics asks, or math asks, or economics asks, or psychology asks, well, there are methods for answering those questions. If you want to know what the structure of the atom is, and you're a physicist, then you use the experimental method of physics. And that method develops and it changes over time. It gets better and better version of itself. But you, as a practicing physicist, you know what method you're supposed to be using in order to answer that question. As a practicing mathematician, if you want to know, well, how are the prime numbers distributed? Well, maybe you guys don't want to know that. I find that a weird and fascinating question. How are they distributed? Like, are they evenly distributed as you go up through the numbers? Are there equally many of them in a given period? Well, it turns out the answer is no. And there's a method for answering that question. It's the method of analytic number theory. And that method sort of is independent of the questions, and it helps you to determine how to answer them well. But philosophical questions aren't like that. To take them seriously, to think about what it is to be good or to be just or to be free, is to engage yourself in addressing a question in such a way that when you address it, you're also asking the question, is this way of addressing it good or not good? Is it appropriate to the question? Is it bringing the question out at its best? And you might start with one method and then update that method and then update it again. But there's never going to be a final method for answering those questions because they're fundamentally historical, because the meaning of the terms that we use to ask questions like that has a philosophical history and it changes over time. And because we're not the kinds of beings that are accessible with respect to some set of answers, I think, this is Heidegger's view at any rate, some set of answers that's unchanging and fixed. So if this is at least a good first order account of what philosophy is, I say, then it distinguishes philosophy from other disciplines like the natural sciences or the social sciences, physics, math, economics, psychology. Philosophical questions have no set methodology, partly because the very meaning of those questions is tied essentially to the history of our way of asking about them. To think well about the nature of justice or freedom or goodness or beauty, we have to constantly keep in mind the way the very meaning of the question interacts with the method by means of which we're asking it. Our method will demand to update itself as its inability to do justice to its question gets clearer. And being human, I think, is like that. I think that's a good characterization of what philosophy is. To ask philosophical questions is to ask them in such a way as, at the same time, to be asking, is this a good way to be asking those questions? And to be human is at every moment to exist in such a way that you hold before yourself the question, is this a good way? Is this a way that's appropriate to the kind of being that I am? Is this a way of being human that holds me out at my best? So too with the task of being human, I say. To engage that task well, to be human in a way that does justice to the proper dignity of the being engaged in the task, is constantly to keep before you the question whether your current way of being human is appropriate to the being you are. If this is a kind of humanism at all, then it's a very different kind than any that came before. To say more about this, however, is a task for another day. Thank you.
So I will field questions.
Great. So thank you very much. My question is about AI. Shocker.
Okay.
So when I hear words like price and dignity, I think the broad expectation that AI is not going to result in better conditions for workers. It's probably as it's integrated, so people say, into the economy, it'll benefit owners instead of workers. And then when I think of AI and Heidegger, I think of Hubert Dreyfus, who based a lot of his exegesis of Heidegger against early attempts at AI. So I guess my question is, today in the context of dignity, how can Heidegger accommodate artificial intelligence?
Okay. Okay, so I think there's a lot of ways to think about this. One thing to think about is, and I think this is really the fundamental thing to think about, not so much the question, what is an artificial intelligence going to be able to do, but what's our relation to what it does going to do to our relation to ourselves and our understanding of ourselves. And one place where I have thought about this a little bit is in the context of the question of artistic creativity. So a question you could ask, somebody asked me to think about it once, so I did, is, could an artificial intelligence be a creative artist? And you might think, well, of course. I mean, you've got all these things that make images, and people are putting them on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and wherever all the time, and they're wonderful or beautiful or disturbing or, horrible or whatever. Isn't that what a creative artist is? And I want to say that, no, I don't think that's fundamentally what a creative artist is. Fundamentally, I think a creative artist is someone who has a kind of general orientation to the culture, to the present, to the moment that they're living in, by means of which they can recognize something that demands to be questioned or provoked or changed. And so I think genuinely creative artists are the ones who initiate whole new ways of understanding what art could be. So I don't know, someone like Picasso, for instance, who changed our understanding of what art could be, or Schoenberg or something like that. I mean, there are certainly much more modern examples too. I think that kind of transformation in the understanding of what an artistic project could be about is a fundamentally human kind of thing. And I think it is a very small version of a much bigger, fundamentally human kind of thing, which has to do with the fact that we're the beings who are engaged consistently in the project of re-understanding what it is to be us. And I think that social transformation in the artistic case or in the broader political or social case takes place in the best case when you recognize about someone's output, let's say Picasso's output, that although it's clearly not art by the standard measure of art that we've always recognized, it somehow is an expression of something that needs to be said and isn't currently being said. And I think that AI doesn't have that sense of what needs to be said. Even the contemporary forms of artificial intelligence are built on recognizing patterns in what's already been going on. So in the best case, they can extend the pattern. They can, of course, do things that are different from the pattern. But I don't think that we should take that to be fundamentally interesting. I mean, a child could do that also. It's only interesting when it's in response to the recognition that I think we think the artist or the social or political transformer has, that this needs to be said now. And only when other people can recognize in that person something like that ability to recognize what's being demanded, do we want to call them, artistic or creative or transformative in the original sense? So I think I started off by saying I think what matters is sort of what our relation to the products of the artificial intelligence. If we let it tell us that this is the way art should be, then we'll be fundamentally giving up on something that's sort of ours, that's at the core of our dignity, which is the ability to recognize what changes need to be made and to express things in response to that recognition. So that's my sort of basic take. I think that artificial intelligence, like lots of other tools, can be a very useful tool, and we should learn how to use it in that way. But I think the danger lies in our giving up our fundamental relation to ourselves in order to give it autonomy over us. That would be very bad.
You alluded at the beginning of the talk to his Nazi, being a member of the Nazi Party.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that and how you filter how you see him through that lens?
Yeah, so this is such an important question, and I will tell you one of the reasons this book is taking so long is because it started out as a commentary on later Heidegger, and it's changed. It's really much more about the question, what's the proper dignity of human being? And this version of it that I've read you is from the it may still end up in the book, but it was there. The task was, what does Heidegger think? And now the task is, what should we think? And I think that's an important transformation. Heidegger was a Nazi. I mean, he was a member of the Nazi Party from 1933 and never renounced his membership. It's an ugly part of his past. And I think it does mean that we have to be very careful when we read him. The thing that gives me hope is that I read Heidegger through the lens of people who are not themselves Nazis, but who find something interesting in him. So Hubert Dreyfus, who was my teacher, was mentioned already. Charles Taylor, whom I mentioned in the text, is a deep reader of Heidegger. Michel Foucault was very deeply influenced by Heidegger. So I think there's something about the position that's independent of his politics. I think he couldn't see that. I think he couldn't understand it, and I think that is an indictment of him. But nevertheless, I think there is some. I think these readings of it show that there's something ennobling to be taken out of it. So that's where I'd like to go. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a sort of like ill-formed question about what you're calling the market economic model of like our self-relation.
Yeah.
And like where Kant fits in with that. I'm thinking about like Hegel and the philosophy of right. So it already in 1820, when Hegel is looking at this history, he thinks of Locke and Kant as really different.
Yeah.
Like really different on this question.
Yeah.
So he would agree in a way that Locke has this like sort of like really, fairly crude way of understanding what it is to be a free human being, which is like, well, we sort of own parts of ourselves and we invest the world with those parts of ourselves and we can then exchange them freely with other people, right?
Yeah.
But I don't. So Hegel looks at Kant and says, well, there's something else, like morality, which is the Kantian bit of the philosophy of right, is like operating on a different level. That is not that. Whatever it is, it's not that, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually Hegel ends up with a picture where, to be properly human is to be part of some kind of ethical community that contains elements of that like transactional Lockean view. It contains elements of Kantian autonomy, but it also contains these like rich, like attachments to other people through institutions that we can reflectively endorse, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just not seeing like how do we end up with Kant in the same bucket as Locke? I'm hung up on that.
Yeah. That's a good thing to be hung up on. So the move is, it's maybe a little bit of sleight of hand, but the suggestion is that Kant, it's a well-known story that you're giving us about the way in which Kant's different from Locke. And what I'm trying to give is the pushback that says, even though it's obvious that there's some way in which he's different from Locke, the fundamental motivation hasn't changed. And you can see that when you see the characterization of the distinction between dignity and price. So that's the move. The move is to say, look, Kant wouldn't have recognized it, but in fact, when you define human beings in terms of this sort of negative fact about them, that they don't have a price, there's some way in which you make the things that have a price more fundamental. And that's the move. And it's really, the intuition is that it's because Kant hasn't pushed hard enough on the question, what's the positive characterization of our dignity, that he hasn't really escaped this presupposition of the culture that somehow the market economical account of things in general is the one that drives you. So that's the suggestion. And of course, he's added a whole bunch of other stuff. What I would need to find in Kant to be convinced that he's really escaped this kind of Lockean view is an account of our proper dignity that's not just the claim that we're the kinds of things that can't be sold for an appropriate amount, or we're the kinds of things that can't be used to some end or another. I want an account that says we're the kinds of beings that are characterized by our doing this, or by our ability to do Y, or by something. And so that's the move is that. Maybe it's not satisfying, but the suggestion is that because he hasn't pushed on that enough, he hasn't really escaped this tradition. It's a little like the move that Heidegger makes in his reading of Kant, of the theoretical philosophy, not the practical philosophy. Heidegger says about Kant that he was right to think that there's some sense in which to be at all depends on time. I mean, time is the form of inner sense, and there's some sense in which temporality is the ground of everything that is. But Heidegger says he didn't push hard enough to give a positive characterization of temporality. He just left the old Aristotelian conception of time, according to which it's a sequence of undifferentiated nows. And so he's inherited that by not pushing on it and giving a positive alternative to it. So it's like that move.
A quick follow-up?
Can I do a quick
Yeah.
follow-up? Right, so, I mean, the most obvious candidate for the Kantian thing would be the activity of self-legislation, right?
Yeah.
So why doesn't that, like, that's the thing that sets us apart from things with enterprises, right? And isn't that like a positive, like, or the capacity of the will to be a law unto itself is actually pretty connected to the kinds of Heideggerian stuff about,
Yeah.
like, well, you're acting in light of an understanding of yourself, right?
Yeah.
So why is that not a good,
Yeah.
or at least isn't that in the direction of some kind of positive account?
I think that's in the direction of the Sartrean kind of positive account. That's the issue. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
In the back here, right?
Oh, me? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've had this question for like a while or whatever, right? And like, it really bothers me. Okay, so I apologize if this question like takes a bit to form, whatever, right? There's like a decent amount to this question, right? Okay. So I noticed, right, that like, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it, right? But it sounds like based off like what you were talking about, right? It sounds like either, I don't know, like Heidegger or you, whatever, right, are skeptical of the concept of like a necessary essence, right, for, you know, human beings or whatever, right? But the issue, right, is that the whole concept of necessity just in general, right, in philosophy, right, is supposed to illustrate, right, that something cannot fail, right, to not be the case or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And like the thing is, right, is that like when you talk about like authenticity, right, and about how like, oh, humans, you know, can't be sold or whatever, right? For like that's still a claim of necessity, right? Even if like logically speaking, even if you know, like even if the implication isn't exactly pleasant, the fact of the matter, right, is that logically speaking, that's still a claim of necessity, right? And so like I'm not, and also like in regards to Kant or whatever, right? It's like, it strikes me that the historical context, right, with Kant, whatever, right, is that he was essentially responding to Hume, whatever, right, who, like, Hume was the skeptic on causality and necessity and all that or whatever, right, and then Kant, whatever, I wanted to establish, you know, some like necessary first principles, right, in response to Hume, right, and so like Hume seems like a coherent account or whatever, right, of how there could be nothing, you know, that necessarily categorizes the human being because Hume just doesn't believe, right, in metaphysical necessity in the first place, right? But like the issue with Heidegger though, right, is that based off what you're saying, right, it sounds like Heidegger, like logically speaking, you know, does believe in some, you know, like necessary set of like metaphysics or whatever, right? Unlike Hume or whatever, right? And so like that question, like that whole thing just left me really confused, right? Because
Good. So you're introducing the term necessity, which is not a term that I used, except sort of to gesture at it in the context of the thing that I was against.
I mean, it's important to Kant, though. Necessity is important to Kant, though. And
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
No. What I said is that necessity is a really important concept in philosophy and in metaphysics, and Kant actually like does invoke necessity.
Yeah, well, definitely, exactly. But what I'm resisting is the idea that the positive account that I was developing has a commitment to a form of necessity when it characterizes itself. So what I want to say is that the in place of necessity is a form of historical authenticity or historical dignity or something like that. So you could think about it in Aristotelian terms. So Aristotle's an advocate of a form of what's sometimes called perfectionism. He says, we're the kinds of beings that are engaged in the project of being better versions of the kind of beings that we are, sort of perfecting ourselves through certain kinds of activities. Ultimately, for Aristotle, the activity of contemplation. I think there's a way in which the account that I'm trying to develop has that kind of structure to it. And that doesn't involve necessity because it's always historically contingent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So like it's not a necessary property of existence, whatever is contingent. Okay.
Yeah.
Metaphysically contingent. Okay.
Historically contingent, yeah, exactly. What it takes to be an authentic, perfectible version of the self at any moment is different. So that, yeah.
Lisa?
Thanks. It's a little bit rough, but so on the market economical analysis of the self-ownership, at least the way that Mike was describing it, the way I'm sort of understanding it. So the account of dignity it implies seems to be a dignity that we can all sort of act in accordance with. But the account at the end, the Heidegger account,
Yeah.
which involves like taking a stand in everything you do and asking whether my current way of being is appropriate to how it should be and all that.
Yeah.
Seems a lot more difficult. I mean, it seems as though the first account is really egalitarian in the sense that we can all sort of act in accordance with our dignity. And I'm just wondering whether it's the case that we can do that on the second account, and if we can't, whether that's a problem.
Good. So, excellent question. So, my sort of general view is that we're all capable of doing it, and we're all often, much of the time, failing to do it, and that the job of philosophy is to wake us up to that task of doing it well. So, I think we are sort of the kinds of beings that are always capable of asking the question of ourselves, whether we're being a good version of ourselves. I mean, think about it in the artistic case. Maybe it's good to have this one. Oh, we lost him. It's good to have this one on the table. So there's Picasso. His task is to be the best painter that he can be, let's say. And he's painting something, and he's painting it, in accordance early in his life, in accordance with the standard sort of techniques and methods of painting stuff, accessible to the standard, forms of artistic beauty. And somehow there's some sense in which he's niggled by the thought or the feeling that this is inappropriate. This is not what's needed. Something else is needed. There's no method for figuring out what the new thing is that's needed. To engage in the process of painting in the blue period, let's say, or something like that, is to play around in the way that you're painting with the question, is this the method for doing things well? And the thought is, we're all always capable of doing that in our existence as a whole. We're often failing to do it. And philosophy is the discipline that sort of pricks us, the way Socrates, the gadfly, pricks us, wakes us up to that task and asks us to hold it before ourselves.
So you think each human being is capable?
Totally, absolutely. I think that it wouldn't be, I think, so there's a second part of it, which is that you have to grow into it. I mean, this is also part of the Heideggerian structure that's taken over by Foucault and others. There's got to be norms in the culture already that make sense of what you're doing so that you can recognize the inadequacy of those very norms and push into the question, how would I do things differently? So a baby can't do it yet. You have to be, so to speak, a full-grown human being. You have to recognize what the norms are in order to recognize their inadequacy. But yeah, this is an account of full-grown human beings, and I think that's one of the constitutive features of being human, that you're capable not only of recognizing whether your activity is sort of lives up to the norms or the standards, but you're capable of recognizing circumstances in which those norms or standards are inadequate to what needs to be done.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. You know, I heard you quote Heidegger at the beginning, language is the house of being. So, and then you went on, I mean, towards the end, and you focused on the idea of authenticity. And I think this particular idea, you know, is very much linked to language itself, you know. Yeah. I know this is maybe the other side of the technical talk that you didn't want to get into. Okay. You know, but if I may just maybe ask you here, because if he rejects all of humanisms, it's because they were not able to find the proper language to get to that primordial, I would call it maybe experiment, the pre-Platonic, you know, I mean, which he develops in other books. Yeah. So the question has to do with exactly the conception of this language that's supposed to be primordial, and that we, because we're the shepherds of the being, and we're also close to it, you know, close to being itself. So we're the only ones who are, in a sense, able to speak it, you know, but we're not finding the right language to proffer it and to put it out there, you know. And in passing, he mentions Holderlin, you know, but in another article of his in Poetry, Language, Thought, what are poets for? I mean, he dwells a little bit more on the role of poets in general in finding those tracks, you know, which have been lost since the pre-Platonic era. And so I just wanted you a little bit to elaborate more on this, because I think this is the difficult part of the level. If not the most difficult part. I mean, it's exactly how to get to that language, how to put it out, and how to get to that being. You know, because they're all interrelated and yeah.
Excellent. Okay. I want to try to answer your question, and I want to, I don't know if I'll be able to do this, try to bring in an example that might help with the thing I was just trying, what's her name again? Lisa. That might help with my struggle to answer Lisa's question. I don't know if I can do both of them. Let me see if I can try. So the question of language. Language is, of course, very important for Heidegger. Language has the structure that I want to say human being has, which is that there are norms for using it that are constantly being challenged and updated and reinvented and renewed, and they're constantly being sort of this reinvigorated in this way in response to a sense that the words that we have or the ways that we have of talking are inadequate to our experience of what is. So language is supposed to manifest that feature of human being. It's our way of expressing the fact that whatever standards we have for communicating with one another are both essential and inadequate. They're essential because without standards for communicating with one another, we couldn't ever, have any chance of understanding each other. But they're always inadequate because there's some way in which those norms fail to characterize some important aspect of what we're doing or saying or experiencing. So language has that feature, and now I think I want to tie it to an example that might help with Lisa's question. The idea that the norms in the culture are inadequate to characterize what someone feels needs to be done. That's the core of the idea here. I want to say Picasso felt, the norms for painting are inadequate. They need to be changed in the following way. And when you feel that need, you're playing with the question, what method is appropriate to what I'm sensing now? And language, I want to say, has that feature. So now I want to try to give an example of what that would be like in a sociocultural context. And the example comes from Kierkegaard. It's not, so I'm going to tell a story about Kierkegaard. I don't have any reason to believe this is true, but if it were true, it would be helpful. I mean, it would be interesting. So Kierkegaard famously had this relationship with this woman, Regina, and he broke off, they were engaged, and he broke off the engagement. Huge sort of kerfuffle in 1840s in tiny Copenhagen, you know, where the 12 elite families all knew one another. And so he breaks off, they get engaged and he breaks off the engagement. And in his journal, he apparently wrote about it, but the pages where he wrote about it were ripped out and have never been found. So we don't know why he broke off this engagement, but he refers to it in Fear and Trembling and in other places. And here's a story that could make sense of that. This is the thing that I don't have any reason to believe is true. Suppose it were the case. Kierkegaard's an upstanding citizen. He wants to do right. He knows that breaking off the engagement is somehow morally bankrupt. It's not a thing one should do. He's made a promise. He should keep it. But suppose he knows is a funny way of saying it. You have to put it in scare quotes. He knows something about himself that's inconsistent with his being married to Regina. We have terminology for it, but in the 1840s in Denmark, maybe they didn't. We would say what he knows about himself is that he's gay. Again, that's a thing I don't have any reason to believe or disbelieve. But if that was the way he felt, and if there was no terminology for it, there were no words for it, there's no way in which it could justify the act of breaking off the engagement. All he could do is say, I know this needs to be done. I know that it makes me a horrible person. And yet I believe that in the future, the standards and norms for assessing moral behavior will be updated in such a way as retroactively to make it the case that that was the right thing to do. That's, I think, a story about the way norms can work in political, social, artistic contexts, the way they're historically laden, and the way that we act on the basis of them with a sense of the context in which they must be resisted or contravened. And it's a story about the way in which, if we do that, sometimes we can be involved in updating those norms, though not by making a choice or willing them to be updated, the way Sartre would have said, but by somehow acting into the community in such a way that maybe will have that effect. So I think language is involved in that. I think that's a version of the story that I think we're all capable of. I think that if Kierkegaard hadn't been, I imagine he was in some ways a kind of amazing person. If he hadn't been that self-attuned, and if he hadn't been that sort of courageous, let's say, in this version of the story, he wouldn't have been able to do that. But we could say now, retroactively, that was the right thing to do. I think we're all capable of that. I think it's very hard. I think it takes courage. But I think that history doesn't happen without it. And that's, I think, a core aspect of what I think our proper dignity amounts to.
Our methods of trying to discover the proper dignity of human beings, that which is like most appropriate for us to create. We failed at trying to searching for that in the past because of our own methodologies. Are there any methodologies you think that have come at least close, the closest? Because I'll use Kant, because I'm having on the brain between it straight.
Okay.
But he established he said that he made a similar claim in which he's all the philosophers have been doing this wrong because they're mixing up the empirical and the metaphysical. And here's my whole new system when we're doing this again, and I'm building this from the groundwork up. So are there any frameworks you think that have come pretty close to finding this proper dignity?
Good. So I think the closest I can come to it is not a philosophical framework, but a phenomenon that I recognize from childhood, both my own and my children's childhood, which has to do with the way people can play. So Heidegger's way of thinking about it, I'm somewhat attracted to this, is that before there was the kind of Platonic transition in philosophy, according to which philosophy became metaphysics, the search for the essential and necessary properties that characterize what is. Before that, philosophers, in the pre-Socratic era, they were doing something different. And the different thing, I think, is a little bit like what we do when we play. So let me try to say first what the pre-Socratics were doing on this account, and second, what the relation to play is. So the story that you can tell about the pre-Socratics that I somehow, I think distantly at any rate, get from Heidegger is that the special thing about them isn't that they learned something, like it's often said Thales was the first philosopher and he was the one who first was a scientist rather than a myth guy. And the view that I'm interested in is more something like, no, it's not that they learned to ask scientific questions instead of believing myths. It's that they started to experience the world differently. They started to experience the world as hanging together as a whole. And one way of saying what the early version of it was in Anaximander and other early figures is that, this is Heidegger, he says they had a word for the world as a whole. It was physis, that's a Greek word. We usually translate it as nature and say they were natural philosophers. But in fact, Heidegger says what it means is something like whooshing up and lingering for a while and then fading away. And so the story is that there were these very sensitive people in the 6th century BCE in Greece, and all of a sudden they noticed that like there's this thing, a storm, it whooshes up and it lingers for a while and it fades away. And that's kind of like the flowers in the springtime, which whoosh up and linger for a while and fade away. And that's kind of like the battle fury of Achilles, which whooshes up and lingers for a while and fades away. And it's kind of like the love of Helen and Paris. It whooshes up for a while and lingers. And that's what it is for things to be. They whoosh up and linger for a while and fade away. So on this version of the story, philosophy is about sort of experiencing the world as hanging together in some way. And if you experience it as hanging together in some way, there's some mood that it's hanging together in that way demands of you. And the name for that mood in the ancient world was wonder. So Plato and Aristotle say, both, as if it were already well known for hundreds of years, philosophy begins in wonder. And so the thought is, for the pre-Socratics, if what it is for things to be is for them to whoosh up and linger for a while and fade away, then what that's supposed to do to us is encourage us to engage with things in the mood of wonder. And we are the authentic versions of ourselves when we do that. That's our task. Now, how's that related to play? Well, I think it's related to play because I think there's some way in which there's no prior method that determines whether you're doing it right. So I used to play a game with our now 19-year-old when we were little, and when he was little, I was bigger, and there was a weird game, and it just I don't know, it was really fun. But it just had no rules, and it went this way. He would say some word, and I would say some other word. And then he would say another word, and then I would say one back, and then we would burst into laughter. And the thing about the game is that, like, it was never clear what the next word was supposed to be. So I might say a word, and he'd say something that meant something similar, or something that rhymed, let's say. And then I'd say something that rhymed, and then he'd say something that rhymed, and then I'd say something that meant the opposite. And all of a sudden we'd laugh. And so the idea there is that there is something that you can recognize. Somehow it's getting boring this way, let's go on. And it sort of grabs you. There's a need there. It grabs you and you respond to it. And it gives you a certain kind of joy. I think play is kind of like that. It doesn't have a prior method. Holding the method before you as a question is part of what it takes to do the performance well, to play well. And I think the pre-Socratics were involved in this philosophical questioning in that way. And that's sort of what philosophy is about.
We have two more, sorry.
Okay.
Time for two more in the back. No, that's you. Yeah.
You began by laying out a series of humanistic positions historically that define man negatively. But it seems to me that if you look at them as a sequence,
Yeah.
You could interpret it as each of them were addressing the primary threat to the view of the self of that time. So the Romans were exposed to new worlds and new cultures, and that's threatening.
Yeah.
In the Christian world, the view of God is so immense that the dangers were reduced to worthless words.
Yeah.
Augustine wrestled with that immensely.
Yeah.
So you have to define yourself in some context against that. Kant had to deal with the potential of the scientific view of the world reducing us to just objects in the world.
Yeah.
Sartre had to deal with how do you protect the self in a godless world. So if you put those all together, it seems to me, rather than just seeing it as though they're just defining things negatively, that humanism becomes essentially an authentic process, asking new questions, new ways of protecting the self from all these threats that are unique, and of course the threat of the economy, the economic view, is a threat in its own right too.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great observation, and I agree with it. What it leads me to think is that each of these people, each of these philosophers, let's say Cicero, Augustine, Descartes, Kant, Sartre, was doing something authentic. They were manifesting the proper dignity of human being by reacting against the thing that they saw as a threat. It's just that when the way in which they reacted against it had a positive context that was inconsistent with what they were actually doing when they came up with it. Because what they were doing was this process that we've been describing, recognizing the necessity of rebelling against X, right? But they did it by saying, it's not X, it's Y, which just institutes another thing that people will feel the necessity of rebelling against. And what I'm saying is that it's that whole process that characterizes what it is to be us. None of the particular bits of content has got it right, because it's what they share rather than what differentiates them that characterizes us. So that's a great way of thinking about it. Thanks.
So our last question.
So one of the things that's come up around is that there's not really a good method for doing philosophy. Of you have these norms of the society, there's some feeling of disgruntlement, disjointment from them, something's not right, you need to change it. And then there's trying to find ways to change it, and that's philosophy. The play seems like kind of primitive, just we're going to try a bunch of random things and see what fits in. I feel like there's a lot more depth in like what kind of methodology you use for figuring out what's going on inside that's causing this disconnect, and understanding why is there this feeling that this norm is bad and what's going on there. And I think that's a whole realm of psychology.
Yeah.
But it's just, why is it so insistent that there's no method for doing that, when it feels like we can come up with methods and evaluate how effective they are at returning the feelings of disjointment to acceptance?
Yeah. Okay, good. I have two answers. One is, I think you probably won't be sympathetic with this, but others might be, but I think it's wrong, so I'm on your side. One is, you might think, well, philosophy does have a method. The method of philosophy is logic. Everyone knows that. Aristotle told us that. That's what the organon is all about. Those are the first things that you study. And only once you've got the method of logic do you know how to ask metaphysical questions. Now, I don't have any sympathy with that. Yeah, I think you probably don't have any sympathy with that. Heidegger didn't have any sympathy with that. But that is a traditional way of thinking about what philosophy is up to. Even in Kant, you get some version of the importance of logic. Of transcendental logic. So that you might think that. I don't think that. I think you're not sympathetic to that. So what else could you say? Well, let me give you a different analogy. This is an analogy that I think gets at the sort of crux of your question, which I heard to be something like, why couldn't there be a method? Sure, it's not logic, but couldn't there be one? I saw you puzzled. Is that not really your question?
It could utilize logic, but it's not like
Okay.
logic is this thing that stands apart.
Yeah, okay. So, but still, so take the question, why couldn't there be some method that we finally get to that allows us to address philosophical questions about the nature of what is? Okay, here's the analogy. I think it's like asking, why couldn't there be a method for jazz improvisation? I mean, there are lots of tools. If you're in a jazz quartet and it's your time to improvise, you better have done a lot of practicing. You better have learned your scales and learned, all your stuff, and you better know the chord progression. But if you do something that's done before, you've failed in a certain way. If you just do something by means of the method that's already been tried, then there's some sense in which you weren't there responding to what's going on in the situation and allowing yourself to be an expression of what needs to be said. So, and you get this version of an understanding of what jazz is about in various accounts of jazz improvisers. I mean, what's the name of the guy who did the Bridge, that famous album from the 50s, late 50s? Anyhow, this guy, sort of famous guy, went under the bridge for the 59th Street Bridge, I think, in Manhattan. For 3 years, dropped out of society. Everybody thought he was great, and he was dissatisfied. And he went and he played 15 hours a day. And he said, my only goal was to when I noticed myself playing something I'd played before, to stop and play something different. And the idea is that, on this version of thinking about it, you're not doing it well if there's some method outside of the situation that's determining what it is that you're going to do. And in a live context, the situation involves what the audience members are saying and who's listening and what your bandmates have done and all the, like, an infinite number of things that determine what's appropriate in this circumstance. So there's tons of skills, there's tons of practice. There's tons of stuff, norms that you need to have sort of instilled in yourself. But if you don't rise up above them, then you haven't really done it right. And somehow that's an analogy for what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, it feels almost like in order to be truly human in this fashion, it's implying a sort of non-deterministic way of how things function. Because if we develop our norms sufficiently enough, we can describe how the human brain works in most respects. Maybe we can't do it exactly right, exactly model how their brain is operating, but we still could probably get some sense of they're using these patterns, they have this dissonance, they feel like if I just play this chord a little differently, because it's breaking from the norm, it will have this effect on the audience. But that in itself is a process.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, it could be a process. What I'm asking for, though, is the kind of openness to the situation that sort of allows you to resist it as a process. I mean, let me try to give it a slightly different. Yeah. Let me try to give a slightly different example, but quite different, I guess. Suppose you're out on a date, and it all of a sudden occurs to you that the person that you're on the date with, it's got a script. Like, they're going through it, and you're just sort of, like, that's not being there, right? There's some sense in which what you want is, in an interaction with a person, is that someone has actually heard what you've said, and been changed by it and responded to it in some way or another. That's I think, a more authentic way of interacting with one another. And if there's a script, it feels like you've missed it.
Can I respond or no?
Quick.
Okay, quick. I can kind of understand that point of view. With the finitary predicament, we only have so much capability. We can only access so much of this universal script, and I can understand his views in terms of that, of saying maybe this thing can exist, but we can't access it as humans, so we need to figure it out.
Good. Okay, so this will be the last thing. But yeah, I agree. Our finitude, the fact that we're finite beings rather than infinite beings like God, is the crucial starting point for the project that I'm interested in. And our dignity as the beings that we are is determined by the fact that we're historically contingent, that we're temporally contingent, that we're physically contingent, and that there's a whole bunch of stuff that's given to us about our situation and our condition over which we don't have control, and that helps to and that our project is to figure out how to be ourselves the best in that, given those kinds of constraints.
Let's thank